sustainability perspective public event organized by UCL's SDG Research Accelerator with UCL Public Policy, UCL Life Sciences, the Bartlett School of Planning, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and last but not least, our partners from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm and the European Environmental Agency. My name is Catalina Turcu, and I'm Professor of Sustainable Built Environment within the Bartlett School of Planning here at UCL, and the founder of UCL SDG Research Accelerator, which is a spin-off that builds on the legacy of the City Partnership Program for Stockholm, supported by UCL Global. You have more information about this on the UCL website. The Accelerator's aim is to use challenge-driven and transdisciplinary research to advance the understanding and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially in relation to the health, climate, and urban goals, and in partnership with relevant stakeholders and synergy with the other SDGs. And I suppose this brings me nicely into the topic of this event. You've already seen the advert for the event. I'm going to say just a few things about how both the academic and policy communities have started to discuss more recently the synergies or so-called co-benefits and tensions or unintended consequences between implementing different sustainability goals on the ground. And we are here today to discuss such synergies and tensions between climate, health, and urban goals. And another interesting point is there is also a perceived disconnect between researchers and the evidence they produce and policymakers and cities and the evidence they use or they need, which is increasingly picked up by the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary debates in urban sustainability. And in fact, I'm just back from an event organized by UCL Public Policy and the UCL Lancet Countdown tracking, which tracks progress on health and climate change here at UCL, which happened yesterday. And there was actually a lot of discussion about these tensions between researchers and policymakers and cities, and how the researchers were keen to use their evidence and help policy makers and the other way around. And there was a lot of discussions around more efficient and effective ways of doing that. The event is going to be hosted by my colleague at UCL Public Policy, Sarah Chater. So Sarah, could you please say hello or wave at us? Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
And we have an excellent lineup bringing in the climate, health, sustainability, but also the policy perspectives from both the UK and abroad, including, and I will introduce you now one by one very shortly. Please just say hello or wave at us so we see who you are. And I will start with our guest from abroad, Dr. Francesco Fusonerini. Hello, Francesco.
Yes, hello.
Hello, thank you, who is the director of Climate Action Center at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Dr. Dario Pizzelli. Hello, Dario.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Who is an expert in environment, human health, and well-being at the European Environment Agency. And now our UCL, our very own speakers, Professor Tara Keck, who is Professor of Neurosciences at UCL, UCL's divisions of biosciences. I can say hello on Tara's behalf. She's currently abroad with poor internet connection, so probably she won't be able to switch on her camera throughout the event. However, she's listening in. Hello, Tara. Then we have Dr. Kate Roll, who is an associate professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Kate, could you please say hello for everybody?
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Kate. And finally, we have Dr. Jeremy Williams, who is a Senior Research Fellow and Policy Evidence Lead at the International Public Policy Observatory here at UCL. Jeremy, could you please say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Great to be here.
Thank you very much. So the floor will be theirs in a minute, but just before some organizations and logistics, first I would like to say that this is an event organized under the Chatham House rules. So we will share information here in a safe space, and all the information shared here is going to be used for research purposes, and no identities will be revealed. Also, the event is going to be recorded for notes purposes and for follow-up. So I hope everybody is okay with that. Second, I suggest we will be listening to all our speakers first, and then we'll take questions. So we'll take questions at the end. However, if you have any questions related to any of the presentations the speakers will give, please do note them down in the chat so we can pick them up at the end and discuss them. And finally, I would like to ask you to keep your cameras and mics off as we go through the different presentations, so we could better focus on the speaker presenting. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And without any further ado, I invite our first speaker to take the floor. Over to you, Francesco. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Catalina, for the introduction, and for well, our UCL colleagues for organizing this exciting event. Yes, so today I'm gonna get started on some topics and hopefully starting the discussion on this coordination between climate goals and all these other sustainability goals, including, of course, health. As an entry point, I will start with this study that we published in 2019, where basically, well, here you see already the results, and you see the source below. Basically, for each one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and each one of the 169 targets, we try to understand how could climate intervention, so more broadly climate action, encompassing both adaptation and mitigation, could be harmonized with achievement of the single targets. So basically, in this representation, you see each one of the goals. To the right of each one of the goals, you see two smaller boxes. These represent all the boxes, smaller boxes represent targets. And then in the line on the top, this is, for instance, goal 1, target number 1. Then if it's highlighted in green, it means that we found potential synergies between achieving that target and the actions that are encompassed in the broader, let's say, climate action agenda, or in orange, possible trade-offs. I'll not go into the detail of the strength of interlinkages, but simply put, methodologically, we did 169 kind of small studies, expert-driven and literature-based. And doing this, we found that all of the Sustainable Development Goals have synergies with achieving the climate goals. But at the same time, there are some important trade-offs that, even if they are less in number, they're still very important, because those are ultimately the ones that are, let's say, slowing down or stopping our climate advancements. Of course, I mean, you're welcome to download the study. There is a rich supplementary material and discussion, but here in just a few minutes, I'll just give a few examples. First of all, climate action has synergies with enabling and reinforcing building prosperous, equal, and peaceful societies. We all know that climate change impacts the poorest the most, increasing inequalities, while many of the provisions in, let's say, the broader climate action agenda help addressing those poverty and inequality aspects. At the same time, climate, and we hear this more and more, also connected to the energy transition, does bring a lot of economic opportunities. Depending on the source, you get $3 to $6 trillion to be invested every year in the energy sector alone for the changes that are needed in the energy system. And that's around 2% of the global GDP. And that will go into a wide range of solutions. So here on the right, you see just almost a short list of possible solutions in different sectors. This is from the latest IPCC 6th assessment report, looking at how different technologies, actions can result in reducing emissions. So again, a lot of changes in a lot of sectors, improving also a lot of sectors. And then, of course, we have a lot of co-benefits on all these other systems. So I'll say a bit more on health, of course, but then also on the functioning of energy and water systems, on more efficient and circular society. And then, of course, this achieving the climate goals, as you probably all well know, goes hand in hand with achieving biodiversity and environmental goals. But still, what is always important to keep in mind, because up to now, obviously, everything paves the way for ambitious climate action, is that some important trade-offs exist. And those trade-offs will materialize more depending on who you are and where you live. Well, of course, I mean, we say the economic opportunity, this $3 to $6 trillion of investments, which of course someone will have to spend. We need to find the finance to, well, change much of our infrastructure to become zero and low carbon. And then again, it depends where you are in the world. So if your country, half of its economy depends on fossil fuels, obviously will be more impacted by the transition than a country where fossil fuels are less central. Jumping a bit more into the topic of today, so I would like to provide a few examples where, let's say, this connection is particularly strong between climate and health. And of course, the key example is actions on reducing pollution, including in cities. So there are many examples of cities that are very ambitious on pollution, and let's say as a co-benefit, or let's say as a synergy, they also address climate change doing that. And then, of course, climate action has many other benefits on health outcomes by, for instance, reducing the happening and also the preparedness to extreme events and disasters, but also putting in place measures to reduce and limit the transmission of diseases. So I'll provide a couple of examples of more in-depth studies that show this linkage. But before that, I just wanted to say one or two words about the center where I work, which is called Climate Action Center at KTH. And I think this is just one of several examples in universities, including, of course, UCL, where at the top of the university, the decision makers have seen that there is really a need to connect across all these topics, because especially on a climate team, it's such a transversal issue that you need all these different disciplines. And also you need to work across research, but also cooperating with the key partners in this area, and also engaging with students and citizens. And for instance, in our case, we are now around 100 researchers that really work collaborating on climate teams, but work in the different parts of this climate transition. So going from people working on efficiency of materials and really technological stuff, building, I don't know, the next generation of solar panels and batteries, all the way to people looking at policy behaviors, even philosophical questions related to the climate transition, which really helps kind of capturing all these synergies and trade-offs between achieving the climate goals and achieving these other goals. By going a bit more in detail, I just wanted to bring here two examples of where climate planning and health planning, but also in some cases poverty planning, really goes hand in hand. And this is another study that we published in 2019, looking at energy poverty in the European Union. So these numbers are actually from a couple of years ago, and they're actually higher now with, of course, the cost of energy crisis. But by 2018, more than 50 million people in Europe were experiencing some kind of energy poverty. Energy poverty meaning not being able to keep your house warm enough, not being able to pay for your electricity bills, and so on. And we do have a lot of research showing that energy poverty is linked to wider health issues. One example is how in cold winters there is excess winter deaths and poor mental health related to energy poverty. And also something quite interesting is that energy poor households are usually the ones that pay the most for their energy. For instance, because they have less access and information about competitive tariffs, and also they have less capability to access some of the market benefits. And this is a clear example where a policy that is, or an intervention that is related to the climate sphere or the energy sphere, like energy efficiency, can go hand in hand with the health policy. And again, examples are measures for improving energy efficiency so that houses are kept warm with, for instance, with less energy, or measures for including renewable energy in heating or even in electricity in households. So this is a first example from, let's say, close up to our home. But also I would like to take another example, and here we go to, well, the Global South, and this is a study we published this year on Sub-Saharan Africa, where on the right, you can see that we have compared for each square kilometer of the continent traditional ways of cooking with more clean ways of cooking. So you can see in the two figures in the top left how, well, this is still a large issue. So around 3 billion people in the world still cook with collected firewood, with a lot of implications of health, causing millions of deaths for indoor air pollution, but also lots of other implications on gender equality and so on. So when looking at these issues, we see that there is really a strong rationale for coordinating, again, climate, health, and poverty interventions here, because we find that if universal access to clean cooking would be achieved, we would save almost 500,000 lives a year in Sub-Saharan Africa only, save a lot of health costs, around $65 billion US, and also save a lot of CO2 emissions, around 600 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is around a bit less than 2% of the global emissions. So again, having knowledge of these issues and having access to this data, we understand how to coordinate and the benefits of coordinate across these policies. And I would like to close on a couple of reflections, and this is again material from the first publication that I show. And also trying to reflect, so if this coordination is so beneficial, why doesn't it happen more? And of course, one of the key answers is, yeah, because it's also quite complicated, because you have all these international agreements, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the Paris Agreement on climate change, but also without forgetting all these other important agreements in the international agenda, like the Addis Ababa Action Agenda or the Sendai Framework. And then we have, let's say, local governments that need to understand how to put all of this knowledge together, and also how to coordinate that with all their national policy priorities on all these different sectors. So again, this is challenging, but of course is very much needed. And we're starting to see more and more governments developing new agencies within the government that really has as a key part, or as the mission of their work, coordinating across all these strategies to try to find all these ways to leverage all these different priorities. And of course, we're very glad that also they relate quite a lot to some of the research that academics like us and many of our colleagues have been doing. Yes, so I think I will close with this.
Thank you, Francesco, for very good start, highlighting from the very beginning all these synergies. We'll take questions at the end, and I would like now to invite our next speaker, Tara. We will be sharing a short film with you. Tara has prepared for us today, but she is listening in, so please do note down any relevant questions, as well as for Francesco's presentation. So Vicky, are we ready to share the screen, please?
Yeah, just one moment.
I don't think we can hear anything, or at least I don't hear anything at my end.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Hi, my name is Tara Keck, and I'm a professor of neuroscience in the Department of Neuroscience, Physiology, and Pharmacology in the Faculty of Life Sciences here at UCL. And first of all, I'd like to thank Catalina for organizing this event. I'm really excited to talk about the intersection of climate into all of these different areas. And I think these events are really interesting to start to think about these big problems that are going to require a lot of different approaches and a lot of people collaborating to solve them. My work is in the area of neuroplasticity, or how it is that our brains change in response to the world around us. And a lot of the work that we've been focused on that's related to climate that I'm going to be talking about today is in the context of mental health support. So how is it after we experience an extremely stressful event that people can get the support that they need to go forward and have healthy outcomes from that? And we do a lot of work looking at ways we can strengthen mental health support and resources at the level of communities and the long-term effects that that can have for people and their mental health outcomes. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then how it is that I think that climate change and the effects that we're starting to already see will make some of these challenges harder, but then also ways that we can start doing things now that help build resilience so that we'll be able to address these. So I'll start with a basic overview, talking about mental health issues. And so in what is very unsurprising to hear, mental health issues are increasing globally. So I think that we all know this. If we think about it in the UK, we're hearing about this in the media a lot, but this is worldwide, and this is from the Wellcome Trust. So what we have here plotted is that we have countries split up. So on the left here, we have all countries. Then just one over, we have lower middle income countries. Then we have in the third group, upper middle income countries, and then high income countries to the far right. And within each group, we have age groups. And so we have young people 15 to 24 years in blue, increasing in groups up to 65 years and older in green. And what you can see is that these are people who have felt anxiety or depression for more than 2 weeks. And this is back in 2020. So this is happening just before COVID hits. And we know that COVID-19 has not been great for mental health across the board, although hopefully with the pandemic reaching a steady state or winding down, we'll be in a position where people start to have better outcomes. But in general, already we were seeing that the average of this is at around 20%. but also that this is not specific to a given country. It's really happening globally. And what we're also seeing, and this is, I think, been reasonably well reported, is that there's very high levels of mental health concerns among young people, and that in general, as we get into older people, that tends to be less the case. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, so I think that it's important to note that that doesn't mean that older people aren't experiencing mental health concerns, but certainly as mental health has become something that we talk about much more, younger people are much more likely to disclose, to be comfortable saying that they need mental health support, as opposed to some older people where we might actually have an underreporting. But what's key to see here is that we do have these strong effects across all countries. And so as we are starting to think about climate and how it's going to affect different countries, we're going to potentially see that mental health is something that will be affected. So how do we think about mental health support when people are in need? So we think about, in my research, people experiencing mental health concerns after extremely stressful events. And so this could be things like the COVID pandemic, where people were experiencing lockdowns. It could be after things like humanitarian disasters. So that could be earthquakes, floods, these type of events. And then we also have things that sort of interpersonal violence, things like that, where people have a single event that is very stressful, and that the outcomes are stressful from this. And so what we have here in this slide is the mental health and psychosocial support pyramid. And so this was originally put forward by the UN Interagency Standing Committee back in 2007. And this was originally designed and has been used to think about providing mental health care in the context of humanitarian disasters. But it's also now been moved to use in the development sector as well for stressful events and isolated incidents. So what we can see is the bottom of this pyramid is basic safe services and security. So following any stressful event, you need to make sure that people are safe. And until people's basic services and security are secure or are restored, you're not going to have an easy way to have people recover. The next thing above is strengthening community and family supports. And so this is a lot of where we've been working. And so this is a really critical part of the whole pyramid. And what we know is that basically by strengthening this area, you first of all support people, but also people in communities are the first people to recognize that someone in their community might be experiencing some mental health problems. And so we often refer to them as the people who are first responders who might identify someone. And this also helps people who are in more severe mental health case, having a more severe mental health case, get into referral pathways. Then next we have focused person-to-person, non-specialized supports. And so these are people, if we think about this in the context of like university, these are well-being advisors. They aren't professional psychiatrists or clinical psychologists, but people who have had some more extensive training and are able to provide mental health care. And then at the top, we have specialized services. And so this would be psychiatrists, psychologists, people that you'd be going to seek support in a medical context. And so what we know from extensive research is that people do better if they have access to social and emotional community support. So right here at this idea of strengthening community and family supports, this second level. So the idea is that if there's something very stressful that's happened, a lot of people, we have this 25, 50, 25 ratio. And so a lot of people, 25% or so, are going to be sort of recover with time and not be affected by it all that much. They're just very resilient. 50% of people, and these numbers are rough, but if they have access to community support and have their needs met and they're feeling sort of supported by their families and their communities, they actually won't need specialized services. So they won't develop more severe mental health concerns. And then 25% of people will actually need more specialized services. And typically people who do need these more specialized services after a single stressful event are people who've had repeated exposure to trauma or other risk factors. And so strengthening this community and family support area is really key, because it means that a lot of people who might have needed specialized services won't necessarily. The second thing that we know is that for people who do need specialized care, they're going in to see a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, couple times a week, if at the most, once a week in some instances. And so they have better outcomes if they have community support that is helping them as they receive this specialized care. So strengthening the community is really sort of a key factor here. And particularly being able to strengthen the community so that we have fewer people needing specialized services is really important, because there is not, I think, a single country that has enough specialized mental health care. And depending on where you are, different countries have different levels of support, but definitely mental health services tend to be oversubscribed. So by keeping people out of the need for these specialized services by providing support at the community level is a way that we can actually build resilience into the system without actually needing to train someone to be a clinical psychologist for several years. And so what we've been doing a lot of is we do a lot of work strengthening these community and family supports. And we've tested out a lot of different ways to do this and have developed programs to help train people who are first responders, like midwives, police officers, community health workers in certain communities. And that really allows these types of workers who encounter people on a day-to-day basis to be able to provide basic mental health care. So basically compassionate, do no harm kind of talking people through the issues they're having, but then also identify this is somebody who may have the symptoms of anxiety or post-traumatic stress and get them into referral pathways that they need. So as we think about this then in the context of climate, humanitarian needs are going to increase with climate change. And we're already starting to see this in that there are more sort of extreme weather events, and that leads to floods, things like that. And so you're going to have people who are more and more people who are experiencing these extremely stressful events. And so it becomes even more important to strengthen these community pathways so that these communities are ready as more and more people are stressed out about the experiences that they've had. And it's worth noting, as with all things, the most vulnerable people in society are most affected by these changes in general and are least likely to receive care. And so it's also about setting up communities where people might not be as aware of mental health needs so that they're able to engage and get the support that they need where otherwise they may have been missed. And then there's one other thing that I think we need to start thinking about. So climate anxiety is sort of an underlying anxiety that young people, for the most part, although it is not specific to young people, have about the fact that in many ways they feel like the world is going to come to an end and nobody cares. And so we're seeing more and more reports of this, and it's been described in a number of different scientific reports so far. But we're starting to see more and more of this in UK high schools, or sorry, UK students, in that they are reporting that they have these anxiety levels. Part of it's related to climate, as well as to many other things. And so this is something else where community support could be really useful to help support young people as they sort of move through their teen years and into adulthood, having to live with the reality of the fact that climate change is a challenge that we are facing. And so what can we do? So I'll start with a couple of the challenges. One of the biggest challenges we have globally is stigma. So what determines our feeling towards mental health? It's our families, it's our culture, it's our friends, as well as other characteristics like gender. So we see that there are lots of things that influence how we feel about mental health. Certainly age also plays a big factor. Younger people are much more open about talking about mental health on average than older generations. And so some of addressing these problems is really clearly that we need to get into a situation where we're able to identify these and get people the help they need. And this is where I think targeting communities can be really valuable. The second thing that is a challenge from a research perspective is that we don't have great measurements for diagnosis in many of these situations. And so that's something that, for example, the Wellcome Trust has put quite a bit of funding towards. And I think that this is a problem that'll be solved, but it is something that it's still a bit tricky. So a lot of the discussion we have with young people is, the difference between emotions and mental health issues, and making sure that these are clear. And there's not always a clear line of exactly when this happens, but, making sure people feel supported for their well-being, but then identifying when it is that it's a more severe mental health issue that needs to have some intervention from potentially a medical point of view. And I think one thing that is a challenge as well, and potentially a solution, so I'll put both up, is the relationship between technologies and mental health issues. So this is something that is just starting to be studied. I think we're thinking, when I'm talking about this, we can sort of put it broadly into social media, but then also internet broadly, 24-hour news cycles, these kinds of things. Technology does seem to be influencing mental health, not always in a positive way. But I think that as these technologies and younger people are more comfortable with technology, this could potentially help with the lack of specialized services that we have in many countries. So we'd be in a position where you would be able to help triage, get people into referral pathways, things like this, at a much higher rate using technological tools. So I think that technology could potentially go a long way here. There's a lot of ethics and concerns to worry about. But I think that this is something that is solvable and could be very valuable. And the final thing that I think is something that's a solution that we need to work towards and is really the basis of our work is how do we build community support for people? As I said, this community support really does play into both preventing the need for more specialized care and also supporting people who do have who have the need for specialized care. And so what we really need to do is start building trained people, and when I'm talking about training, we're talking about a day's training, a couple of days training, and not an advanced degree, but training people to be able to provide compassionate care. And I think that one of the challenges of these, when we're thinking about policy, is that there's been a lot of funding cuts to community services and community infrastructure, and that's really where I think we're going to need to solve these problems, is at the level of the community. And so I think that really one of the key things is starting to refund and find ways to build community so that people are identified and are able to receive the support that they need as we start having more and more isolated events and needing to deal with these mental health concerns. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tara. We won't take any questions now. Incredibly interesting presentation, and I have a lot of thoughts and probably questions as well. We'll pick up on some of these questions at the end. We'll move swiftly onto our next presenter. Kate Roll. So Vicky, if you could please stop sharing the screen.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. It's been really interesting to hear the other speakers. I'll have some overlap, but I see this as sort of synergistic. I did want to start before I started sharing my screen. For those who are joining online, do you guys come more from a health perspective or more from an SDG perspective? So if you know more about health than SDGs, raise your hand. If you can put your hand function up, I'm just curious. We see some raised hands. Okay, we've got some, yeah, absolutely. And what about people who know more about SDGs? They feel more comfortable in the SDG space than the health space. Yeah. Okay, so those of you who are raising your hands now, you're more like me. So I'm a political scientist. I am at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where we work with governments. We have an MPA program, a Master's of Public Administration. And prior to coming here, I worked in international development, but also at the Said Business School at Oxford. So I've sort of crossed a bunch of different spaces, all of which are increasingly interested in SDGs, and all of which have a really important intersection with health. So I'm coming to this prompt much more from the SDG side than from the health side. And I'm going to share my screen, but I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But really nice to see that mix in this group. Okay, here we are. Okay. So I've just sort of teed this up a little bit, but I'm just going to move this so I can see my own. There we are. Like I said, I'm a political scientist. I work across all different kinds of stuff: politics, development, business, technology. I do a lot of sort of work that's grounded in anthropology, so a lot of interviews with people. And my early work was all in post-conflict transitions. In recent years, I've been doing more and more work around the SDGs. And I'm the chair of SDSN UK, which is the Global Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's the hub in the UK, and it's a network of over 20 universities. And it really tries to bring together folks at different universities who are working on this, who are trying to change curriculum, who are trying to motivate research, who are trying to change policy. So we work in those areas. And then part of my own research and practice has been working with policymakers on things like SDGs and taxation, and SDGs and data. But these are really cross-cutting themes. And maybe one more piece to say, or actually, let's go to the next slide. You know, my perspective on the SDGs and my perspective on the world is bifurcated. There's part of me who sees the SDGs as a normative statement, the way the world should be, what we want. I think these are all good goals. I want all of them to come to fruition. I care about implementation and how they get advanced. But I also have, you know, the other hat, which is the more of the academic hat on, which is saying, you know, these are a political product, and asking questions about, you know, do the SDGs work, or how do they work? How do they influence policy and practice, or in what ways? And then also sort of looking upstream, where did they come from? You know, why do the SDGs look the way they do? You know, why do we not have language and culture in the SDGs? Why are LGBTQI plus issues not represented in the SDGs? These are a negotiated political process. And so this idea that the SDGs are political and their implementation is political is very key to the way I see them and work on them. And it's also very key to my institute. So like I said, I'm part of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And this phrase that I've got up on the screen, innovation is political, is on our tote bags, on sort of everything. And it really speaks to this idea that the changes that we need, the innovations that we need, have political consequences, but they also demand the involvement of the state, of political actors, and they need political will. We had a speaker from Vinova, an innovation agency recently, who said innovation is political and it's also existential, right? Because the kind of investment, the kind of energy transitions we need in order to deal with the climate emergency, these are also political, and these are innovations that need to be led by the state or with strong state involvement. Good. So I'm going to talk through three things. And like I said, these overlap with what other speakers have mentioned. But I think for me, these are the core issues that I think about and the core issues that come up when we think about SDG implementation and the SDGs more broadly. So the first one, Francesco has covered very well, and he has done excellent work on this. But this idea of SDG interactions. So I'll talk about this first, and I'll talk a little about financing, and then I'll end with buy-in. So the Sustainable Development Goals, we always see them in this grid. We see them sort of equal size little boxes. I actually think this does a disservice to the way we need to be thinking about the SDGs, because ultimately they need to be interacting and they need to be indivisible. So they're connected to each other and they can't be disconnected from each other. We can't say we're just going to focus on one. And again, this is both from a normative perspective. These are all important. We have the no one left behind principle with the SDGs, but also because how can you talk about health and not talk about poverty? Or to go to Tara's presentation, how can you talk about health and not talk about climate, right? So there are interactions between all of these. And this is also, not only sort of a logical way to think about the SDGs, but it's a smart way to think about health. So it's a holistic view of health. It says communities matter, work matters, policy matters, inequality matters. And even though the SDG 3, which talks about health, isn't specifically speaking about social determinants, the whole idea of SDGs being interactive and indivisible is sort of grounded in a social view of health. We also think about health as being both an input and an output of SDGs. So having people who are feeling good in themselves, who are healthy, who are able, that makes a more productive workforce, right? That is important for the economy. So that's an input to other SDGs, but it's also an output. We both care about that, intrinsically, about having a healthy and well living population. So this is another sort of visualization, again, of what Francesco talked about, where we're starting to see different efforts to map these interactions. One thing that does make the SDGs challenging is it's almost a game of what's not connected rather than what is connected. And so measuring how connected they are and in what way becomes a really important methodological question. But this idea of connection is very key. So this is a one that looks particularly at hunger, health, and energy, and water, but there's lots of other issues like that. And this idea of enabling and constraining becomes super important from a policy perspective. Policymakers have been particularly interested in the idea of enabling SDGs. Are there sort of keystone SDGs that if we work on, will have good knock-ons to the other? And it comes from this point of, if you say everything is important, that actually creates some problems for policymakers because they need to be able to prioritize, they need to be able to make decisions. So looking at interactions is one way that policymakers have addressed this. This is again from that report I looked at previously, and I pulled this little screenshot because it's saying we've got an interaction between hunger and health. I think everyone sort of would recognize that. And in some ways, the steps that we would take to address hunger around things like increasing agricultural productivity, that would have a positive impact on health. But we also can think about ways in which increasing agricultural productivity could have negative effects. So this is not to say this isn't, we all could figure this out and there's really good resources on this, but from a policymaker's perspective, how you do that, how you manage those interactions becomes very, very important. So it's bidirectional and then it's multivalent. It's either positive or negative, and that arrow here can go in either direction. So this is just sort of to say this kind of idea around interactions is super key, both for understanding the SDGs properly and thinking about them in terms of policy response and policy appraisal. A final note, and this is a quite sort of an academic note here, is that these contradictions or these complex interactions are in some ways baked into the idea of sustainable development. Early critiques of sustainable development, going back to the Brundtland Commission, are saying, is this an oxymoron? And this quote from Lele, who's looking from a post-colonial perspective, is saying, well, is this a metafix? Calling something SDGs or pulling people together around these terms like sustainable development, does this bring people around the table who ultimately don't agree when we get down to the nitty-gritty? So these kind of complexities, these interactions, these contradictions are inherent in the term sustainable development and then in the SDGs themselves. Good. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about, and this is a whirlwind tour of some core issues, is SDG financing. Super important. So again, we're back to our grid. So I said this is misleading in that first set of slides because it doesn't show interactions. I also think this is misleading because it doesn't show where the money goes. It doesn't really give an indication of what's being funded. And if we think of it, these are all the same size, they're actually not all the same size when you look at things like investment. So this was some work done by Global Compact that was looking at corporate commitments and corporate investment into SDGs. But we see, there are some left behinds, and the same analysis could be done for governments or for the UK government, for example. So there are areas that are getting more attention and more investment and others that are getting much less. So just thinking about these as all equal and non-interacting is again another sort of fallacy. So we need to be thinking about where money goes and how investment decisions are made. So this is what may be intuitive to you guys, but corporate investment is uneven. That's the previous slide. State investment is inadequate. Again, to pick up on some of the stats that Francesco mentioned on what it will take to address climate change. We're working in the context of post-austerity, post ? Neoliberal era in the UK, where the NHS has been chronically underinvested in. How are we going to meet these SDG goals if there isn't the level of investment and we don't have the ability to make that investment, particularly coming off the global financial crisis and the tech booms and all of that, which had been funding some of this public sector investment. This puts a huge amount of focus on what we call domestic resource mobilization. So are states bringing in enough money to support schools, to clean streets, to lay new roads, to fix water and sanitation? Is there just enough public money to make those investments, including things like national health services? And so this links our question of, the SDG conversation to that on international financial architecture, on debt, on what is called BEPS, base erosion, so your tax base, and profit shifting, so tax havens, right? And the UK is pretty bad on this front, right? A lot of these crown territories, whether it be the Isle of Man or Bermuda, or the British Virgin Islands, they are eroding the ability of the state to collect the full taxes that it needs in order to do things like support education, where investment has been dropping, or to support the health services, which are so in need of that investment in order to reach the SDGs and treat people well. We've been doing a little bit of work at IIPP around SDGs and tax, and trying to say we've got a lot of focus on that idea of domestic resource mobilization. Is there enough money for the SDGs? But also saying, how can we use the SDGs and taxation in a market shaping way? How can we use tax incentives and other tax instruments to push people, push firms to invest in greener and more equitable directions? And so that's sort of taking that idea of tax as a lever, as a leverage point for the SDGs, and trying to advance that. So that's been really interesting work that we did. That Biscay is a region in northern Spain where Bilbao is, and they have a very interesting and forward-looking government there that we've been doing some interesting work with. So happy to pick that up. But I want to close out on the final point. So the final point is SDG buy-in, right? And this is extremely important. The SDGs are sort of soft international law. Dario's the lawyer here, so I'll leave this to him. But UN member states have signed up to the SDGs, but there isn't an enforcement mechanism for them. And so they're what a scholar called Bierman calls governance through goals. So we're trying to induce change through creating common goals, through creating reporting mechanisms, through, this is Eurostat, some data from Malta on health, by saying, hey, look, you're falling behind your peers, catch up with them, creating political will, political pressure to shift towards the SDGs, creating funding commitments, all of that. But it's a mobilization process. It's not an enforcement or coercive process. So it's a really interesting one. How do you get the political will to move these forward? How do you get political parties bought in? Because otherwise, these investments that I mentioned before will not happen. And I think the bad news, and again, I'm focusing on the UK. You can tell by my accent, I'm not British, but I lead SDSN UK and have been here a long time. We have some key strengths here in the UK. The Office for National Statistics is absolutely at the forefront of SDG data work, presenting data, having more complete data sets, doing some really innovative things. And the UK has commitments to net zero and has been doing very good work on energy transition. But from a governance perspective, there's a lack of central coordination. The different departments have been tasked with implementing the SDGs, but there's no oversight, there's no proper coordination. There's still an international development framing, so FCDO, which has followed on from DFID, the Foreign Development Agency. They're still a key player here, and they aren't able to push the domestic agenda where things around health, climate, education, employment, all of that is affecting folks in the UK, not just abroad. And that's a key change of the SDGs versus the MDGs, that they apply to all countries and all people. And so this, I note the Measuring Up 2.0 report, which was a recent assessment that we co-led with a few other actors, just sort of trying to say, where is the UK right now? And these were sort of our key findings. A couple more data points. The Prime Minister, so this is looking at Boris Johnson, but continues up to today, has only mentioned the SDGs twice since 2021, which is really pretty poor for something that's supposed to be a global agenda. And these were both in the context of state visits. So with the US, with Biden, and then with Modi with India. And there's only been one, what's called voluntary national review, which is when the government mobilizes to do a self-assessment. And this is really one of the key mechanisms that's built into the SDGs to have governments keep themselves accountable and share their progress. And, you know, it's looking not so good about the UK doing another one, right? And we're already hitting the halfway point. So we'll see, but, you know, there's concern about political will in the UK around the SDGs as a framework and around these core ideas. So to sum up and close, you know, the SDGs demand a networked, coordinated approach. Health is intrinsically linked to other SDGs and vice versa, right? These are all linked. These are all, you know, cannot be disconnected. You cannot just focus on one, right? The whole point of the framework is that they're linked. And they need to be invested in, right? Innovation is political. They need state investment, which when you get down to it means a fair and a functioning economy, right? Which means fair and functioning tax system. It means a fair and functioning way of the state gathering resources and distributing them. Because without that, we don't have the resources to support public health. We don't have the resources to support education. We don't have the resources to support decarbonization, innovation, investment, all the things that are absolutely essential. And this mobilization and this reimagining of the economy and of, you know, the UK and other nations in this way, they depend on state capacity, political leadership, and political will. So this is ultimately a political project. So I'll sort of close on this quote, you know, innovation is political, sort of the case I've been making, the SDGs are political. And then this recent piece from Bierman, which is really from a study about, you know, how have the SDGs worked? He says, while the 17 SDGs constitute a strong set of normative guidelines, their national, local implementation and dissemination across societal sectors remains political, which is both sort of, you know, too bad if you're in a place where there hasn't been buy-in, but also maybe to end on a positive note, if it is political, it means that political mobilization, civil society, universities, SDSN, all of these actors, you know, have the ability to push that and bring this forward and set the agenda. So yeah, thank you. I'll close there. And this has been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for your presentation and for actually zooming out of the climate and health goals and bringing into the focus, you know, this complexity and relations between the different things we have to do in society. And I think that's the main reason for organizing this event. And all the other speakers, I think we think along the same lines, and we are saying the same things from different perspectives. And I sympathize with you in regards to the, you know, the sustainability focus, which sometimes knocks you about and around because you do not have a specific focus, but it's so useful because it puts things in perspective, I think. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I'm sorry to take the space, we stay well with the time, regarding the UK's progress on the SDG, what I have to say is that we'll have a post-SDG framework. International organizations such as the UN, UNEP, and other organizations within the UNEP already working on this post-SDG framework, which apparently is going to have less indicators presented in a different, less goals perhaps, and more targeted and presented in a different format. And there is a lot of discussion around how do you weight these different indicators, the way you present present them because it's a very linear, pyramidal in a way, the matrix of SDG. So I'm afraid the UK will have to catch up on some of this work in decades to come. So thank you again. We are now ready to move into the second part of our presentation, our event, which will be focusing on policy perspectives. And I'll invite to the floor Dario Piselli, who is speaking from the European Environment Agency.
Yes, hi everyone. Let me just share very quickly my presentation. All right, you should be able to see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Do you see it? Let me see.
If
Okay.
you go into presentation mode, we can see it, but it's fine like this as well, whatever.
No, I will go into presentation mode. Okay, now you should be able to see it. Oh, right, this is from, actually not from where I wanted to start. All right, so thank you very much for having me, and it is a pleasure to be able to participate today. I'll try to offer a bit of a European perspective on the interface really between climate, health, and cities, which goes beyond in a way the SDGs, because then it interacts with, of course, the EU regulatory and policy framework. First of all, just for those of you who may not know us, the European Environment Agency is one of the technical agencies of the European Union, and we collect data to analyze and assess the state of the environment and the implementation of European environmental policies. So we are really an interface between science and policy, and we have 38 countries that are part of our network. So we not only have the EU countries, but also a number of other countries that are fully members of the EA or cooperate with it. Unfortunately, we don't have the UK any longer after Brexit, which is something that we regret. We have been working now for many years on issues relating to the interface, I would say, between climate, health, and cities, looking, of course, at the health impacts of climate change, looking at adaptation, the state of adaptation actions in Europe. Most recently, last year, we had a report on climate change as a threat to health and well-being in Europe, with a focus on heat and infectious diseases. More broadly, we host, as the EA, we manage a climate and health observatory, which was launched by the European Commission as part of the 2021 EU strategy on adaptation to climate change. And as part of this observatory, we try to improve the knowledge base for policy on climate change and human health, try to bring together resources and expertise from different organizations. Partners include the other technical agencies of the EU, but also WHO Europe, the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. And we really try to facilitate learning across countries and organization through this observatory. So now going to the topic, I will first try to really give a first snapshot of the EU level kind of situation in terms of impacts of climate change on health, if possible, with a focus on cities. And then I will discuss very briefly something about policy, like kind of the policy context in the EU. In terms of the impacts, of course, the first thing that we should think about is that already now high temperatures are deadly. Already now they represent absolutely the highest proportion of fatalities associated with natural disasters and catastrophes in EU member countries. But this is, of course, going to increase as the number of health-related heat wave days, which means essentially heat wave days that are likely to cause impacts on health, is likely to increase quite a lot under high emission scenarios in Europe. For example, if you consider that in the baseline period between 1971 and 2000, no parts of Europe had more than 5 health-related heat wave days, it is possible that parts of Southern Europe will have over 60 days per year of health-related heat wave days in the coming decades. And importantly, our societies are increasingly vulnerable to heat, which is, besides being driven, of course, by aging societies and chronic diseases, also driven by urbanization due to, of course, the role that urban areas have in, of course, the high density in cities has in creating what is called as urban heat island effect. So, of course, exacerbating temperatures in cities. And this also creates unequal impacts in society because, of course, the elderly and vulnerable groups tend to be more vulnerable to the impacts of heat. According to projections by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, 30,000 Europeans could die of heat every year under the 1.5 degree scenario. Again, by the end of the century, or 90,000 even under a 3 degree scenario. And as I was saying, of course, this has a major inequality dimension and vulnerability dimension as well. This is just to give an idea about the fact that, for example, hospitals, healthcare facilities, and schools in European cities are quite vulnerable at the moment. Basically, almost half of hospitals and schools are in areas that are at least 2 degrees warmer than the average of the city. And only 16% of the area that is close to healthcare facilities and 9% of the area in close proximity to schools is green space. So this is also, again, quite important, zooming in on the inequality dimension and the vulnerability dimension. The other big topic is, of course, the issue of increasing climatic suitability for disease transmission in Europe. This is, again, a major focus of the report that we published last year. And this is just an example relating to a mosquito, Aedes albopictus, which is a vector for dengue, chikungunya, Zika. And already now, the reproduction rate for dengue has been increasing over the last 70 years, essentially. But the projected climatic suitability index for this mosquito is going to increase. And this is just an example. And I make this example because, for example, for dengue, which is one of the diseases that are transmitted by this mosquito, cities represent one of the ideal environments for transmission. So, of course, cities are likely to be affected by this increase in the transmission of certain diseases, both vector-borne diseases, but also in some cases food and waterborne diseases as well. There's also the issue that was also touched upon by Francesco at the beginning about the synergy and the joint impacts of climate change and pollution, not just air pollution, but also, for example, increased exposure to harmful chemicals that may happen as climate change causes increasing floods or increased bioaccumulation of mercury in the food chain. In this case, climate change and pollution reinforce impacts on humans, including in cities, in causing impacts on health. And of course, also flooding, droughts, and water scarcity. So extreme weather beyond, and its impacts beyond heat that we were discussing at the beginning. And again, here, important vulnerability dimension because vulnerable groups are generally such as, areas with high unemployment rates, areas with a higher concentration of elderly people tend to be located in more flood-prone areas in Europe. And then there's all sorts of other issues, again, related to droughts and floods and water scarcity. So this, of course, is a very complex scenario because it relates to many different issues that will impact health, and again, specifically health in cities. It also relates from a EU policy perspective to quite a fragmented landscape. Of course, a landscape where interactions have been growing, but it's still fragmented, I guess, by the very nature of these issues. And Kate was touching upon the issue of SDG interaction, and I think it's very much related here, because the issue of climate and health, and particularly with respect to cities, of course, lies at the interface of different agendas, including EU policy agendas. On the one hand, climate mitigation and adaptation. On the other hand, health, but also biodiversity, urban agendas, all of which have, of course, recently have experienced a big increase in ambition as a result of the European Green Deal, but at the same time, they have their own, let's say, dimensions that need to be considered. And one, of course, is the fact that the EU institutions have different levels of competence over these issues. Of course, the urban agendas is more kind of a supporting and promoting role, but then it's something that needs pretty much to be implemented at local level. On health was until recently primarily a member state responsibility, even though the role of the EU as a coordinating and funding actors has grown very much in recent years, especially as a result of the COVID pandemic. And then all sorts of cross-cutting of topic areas that interact with these cross-cutting issues: disaster risk reduction, as I was saying, flooding, biodiversity and green spaces, buildings, and the renovation wave that the EU has been promoting as part of the EU Green Deal. Urban sustainability agendas more broadly, as exemplified by the Covenant of Mayors, for example, the Green City Accord that the European Commission has promoted. So of course, the level of national and local implementation in order to align climate and health goals in cities is fundamental. And this is an analysis that was done as part of the Climate and Health Observatory on adaptation solutions contained in national policies on climate and health. And as you can see, there's different levels of incorporation of different types of actions. Some of them, the more related to awareness raising, monitoring, research, are quite widespread, but the focus on developments that may yield cross-cutting benefits, for example, investments in nature-based solutions, are a bit lower down. The focus on vulnerable groups is also very low down in these agendas, often in these strategies. And also the role of the healthcare sector is not always very well recognized, as you can see, in terms of, for example, having strategies for helping healthcare facilities cope with the impact of climate, the education of health professionals. At the level of local adaptation as well, mayors that participate in the EU Covenant of Mayors do consider health as part of the local adaptation actions that they're planning, or that they committed to plan, that they committed to implement as part of their participation in the Covenant of Mayors. At the same time, level of implementation varies, and of course, as we know, it can be a significant challenge at the local level. One thing that, of course, I would say is the primary example of co-benefits is, of course, green spaces, as they not only directly support health and well-being, but they also contribute to several climate and biodiversity co-benefits in terms of CO2 uptake, in terms of shading buildings and helping then energy savings in buildings, in terms of providing habitats for urban biodiversity. And then again, increasingly evidence that they directly contribute to health by improving opportunities for physical exercise, relaxation and restoration, supporting the immune system, offering opportunities for social cohesion and social interaction. And here as well, again, just to mention once again that there is a very heterogeneous situation in Europe in terms of availability of green spaces, but also, as I was saying earlier, in terms of how accessible these green spaces are for different social groups. So to offer some final messages, I don't know what happened here, I'm sorry. So just to conclude, climate mitigation and adaptation solutions in cities are urgent to protect human health, and there is a huge potential of targeting synergies. Green space is one thing that I just focused on, but as Francesca was mentioning, measures to reduce both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the energy sector, in the construction sector, and these though need to be implemented in ways that, of course, also take into account the potential for trade-offs and that recognize the importance of unequal exposure and unequal impacts on vulnerable groups. So there needs to be a focus on socially just responses. One last thing, it's related, as I was saying, to the need to have greater involvement of the health and healthcare sector in climate, in planning adaptation solutions in cities, but also in implementing solutions that build resilience, that build awareness. And at present, this is relatively less considered in national and local adaptation actions, but it's of course fundamental to make sure that we align the climate agenda with the health agenda, also by having this, great sense of ownership by the health and healthcare sector, which of course it's fundamental in prevention, in treatment, and in ultimately ensuring health in our cities. Thank you very much with this. Happy to take questions in the discussion later.
Thank you, Dario. Thank you for bringing in the European perspective. We very much value, you cannot stop ecosystems at the borders of the UK. So I suppose, or environmental impacts. So I suppose we'll have to take that into consideration, even if we are not part of the EU anymore. Thank you for bringing in the city's perspective as well, and I hope we'll have time to pick on the discussion around what we know about climate adaptation as opposed to climate mitigation happening in the UK, but also Europe. So I'll stop there with my comments. Thank you again, and the floor is yours, Jeremy. Jeremy is our last speaker, and after Jeremy, we'll have time to take a few questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catalina, for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone, for the great presentations so far. I'm the last speaker, no PowerPoint for me this afternoon, and I will talk about a bit about this from a city's perspective. And I have four, reflections from a city perspective on the health, sustainability, and climate outcomes intersections. 4 reflections on the big policy challenges, and maybe 4 potential solutions if we can take going forward. But before we do that, I'll talk a little bit about me and how I come to sit here today. I'm from something called IPPO, that's the International Public Policy Observatory based at UCL, which was set up to bring and synthesize evidence in front of policymakers. We look at some of the big strategic challenges facing the UK and indeed other countries today, including net zero, place and spatial inequality, and others. You see this intersecting cross-cutting issues are kind of our bread and butter. I also look after our Bloomberg-funded work on cities, looking at some of the big issues coming in front of cities, particularly in the post-COVID recovery space. I do have a hat on as a former practitioner of city policy, having worked in local authorities in the UK. So I've been on the other side of the fence in terms of actually trying to implement some of this stuff. And in terms of my kind of academic background, I've worked in urban studies. I read a PhD around public space, democracy, and political possibilities. So I have various, angles which I can come at some of the issues that this question of how do these 3 UN sustainability goals intersect. How does that work? So we'll start with some reflections on the policy perspective through a city lens, and this has come up already, but the first is being that these things are obviously very interrelated. We just heard in the previous presentation the question of how parks hit in terms of their public health benefits, in terms of they have benefits in terms of climate. Public transportation is another one of the key ones. So I think often when you're on the practitioner space, getting down to the nitty-gritty of attacking these issues on the ground, you are hitting some of these more, lofty sustainability goals through doing it in that way. And just as the issues on the ground are cross-cutting, so are some of the quick wins which speak to this. One of the big ones we've seen, after COVID has been free or cheap public transportation, which has been a good way to hit both the sustainability goal in terms of encouraging things like modal shift, getting people out of cars onto public transport, also hitting things around inequality and the health benefits of getting people out of cars, and the mental health benefits of having people not worry about having to pay for expensive transportation. And you see this as well in terms of innovations around things like subsidies for retrofitting homes, where you'll have obviously a benefit in terms of encouraging climate outcomes, of there being less emissions, but at the same time you improve the mental health of the people in the home through less bills and so on and so forth. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about COVID and how COVID showed the impossible is in fact possible. If we think back to the early days of the pandemic and the early days of lockdown, I'm sure we were all struck by the sense that the things that were happening were almost unbelievable they were happening. And at the start of COVID, I was quite optimistic that the fact that these seemingly unbelievable things were happening would lead us in the post-COVID period to maybe be ambitious around the political possibility of confronting some of the big issues which the sustainable goals are an attempt to do so. And I think maybe that lesson has not been learned in our keenness to kind of get back to normal in the post-COVID space. So I'd encourage us to think in terms of that sense of thinking the impossible in terms of confronting some of these big issues and translating that in terms of how they are enacted on the ground in terms of public policy. Fourth reflection is around inequality, how combating inequality is key. We all know that wealth inequality is also health inequality, and attacking the root causes of this inequality, I think, will have benefit, will in many cases involve a confrontation with the economic system, will have ability for us then to confront some of the bigger goals which the climate goals talk to. So, policy challenges. I'll start with two paradoxes and then two further reflections. The first paradox is the role of cities. Cities are increasingly influential venues for action, and we see things like the C40 mayors and the Global Covenant of Mayors, where particularly in where there's the national context, maybe less forward thinking in terms of confronting climate and other goals, that cities are the venues in which some of these actions are the coalface, in fact, which some of these actions are being taken. But at the same time, cities are obviously some of the biggest sources of emissions on the planet. You've seen I'm sure anybody who's marked a Geography and Urban Studies paper in the last few years will have seen the fact that 70% of the world's population will be living in cities by 2050. So you have this paradox of cities being the venue in which some of the climate goals can be attacked, but at the same time being the cause of that. Paradox number two is around interconnection and locality. The world has never been more interconnected than it's been in the past, but at the same time, the local is back, and the messiness and the particularity of the local is back. And you see this sometimes in the things like attachments to place manifesting themselves in things like populism and so on and so forth. So any kind of implementation of these goals on the ground needs to take into account the fact that we're very interconnected, but at the same time, people particularly feel that they've replaced attachment as, almost paradoxically, they see their places becoming more like other places because of this global interconnectedness I've talked about already. Third, the financial context. We need to look at the fact that particularly post-austerity context, and particularly in the UK and local authorities, there's not a lot of money to implement these goals. You have the stripping out of the local policy functions, causing it being quite difficult to have the policy capacity on the ground to implement some of the translate these broad goals into action on the ground. The capacity to do that is often lacking in this context. And fourth, we need to think about democratic accountability. If you ask the average person on the street, do they know what the UN SDGs are? They wouldn't know what you're talking about. And we need to think about, particularly in a context of populism, where there is an increased distrust in institutions, including universities, we need to think about the way in which we have these goals, firstly being actually accountable to people on the ground, and also translate the way we're talking about it in this quite high level session into the language of people on the street. So, 4 potential solutions before we go to the Q&A. Firstly, and this is me blowing the trumpet a little bit, the use of evidence. Evidence is very useful both in terms of persuading people in a democratic context of the value of doing something, but also to inform best practice in policymaking. That's part of what we try and do at Hippo. We acknowledge the limits of maybe technocracy, but at the same time, synthesizing evidence and doing research and bringing it in front of people can allow these lofty goals to be put into action by policymakers on the ground. Secondly, we need to acknowledge the context. I've talked about this a bit already. The fact that there is a collapse of trust in institutions. We've seen, for example, in the Dutch election last month, the recent Finnish election, you have anti-climate change parties coming into getting large amounts of votes. And I think we need to speak to that context and not retreat into a language of thinking about these people are victims of misinformation, and actually wonder about why this lack of trust in institutions has come into being and confront that head on, rather than retreating into making excuses about, oh, these people are misinformed or what have you. Thirdly, we need to self-situate our role as academics and think about the role of the university as a social institution, which should be leading the conversation in society and not retreating into being a conversation with itself. So I'm glad we have at least one other person not an academic on this call. I was quite concerned this would be a venue where academics talk to each other, then nothing happens outside. So very pleased we have that as the case. And fourth, we need to think about the fact that the implementation of these broad goals will only happen through a sense of collective social responsibility and social agency. And that involves society having a stake in these goals and having a stake in how they are implemented. On that topic, IPPO is doing a piece of work on envisaging a net zero future. That is, how do we think about what society will look like in, say, 2050, and how do you go about arranging a national and indeed international conversation to get consensus towards that? And we're doing a piece of work where we're looking at other national conversations and citizens' assemblies on contentious topics elsewhere. We'll be making recommendations in terms of how the UK government can take such a conversation forward. And we think that in terms of being able to bring people with you and be able to have these tricky problems go from these lofty goals to actually be translated on the ground, you need to bring people with you, which is why we require these big conversations, which we have to be leading. So that's it for me, and thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for bringing us to a close of our presentations in a very timely manner. Very interesting paradoxes and solutions. I do have some questions, but I would like to pass on the floor to my co-host, Sarah. So I think we are ready for your questions, so please fire on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catalina. And thanks to all the speakers for some really thought-provoking presentations. I feel like there's so much I could say trying to reflect on some of the themes that jumped out of those. But I will try and confine myself to a few remarks. I assume everybody on this call is in agreement about the importance of using research evidence to inform public policy. But I imagine we all also recognise the challenge that persists in doing that. In particular, I think the challenges in terms of routes, what are the routes for getting evidence into policy, particularly at the city level, but also how we link across different policy levels in the way that so many of our speakers today have very eloquently set out. I think it's also the case that climate is a sort of paradoxical area in itself, to build on Jeremy's paradoxes. There are very well established structures for feeding evidence into the policy in some areas, and the IPPC is a notable example. But at the same time, there are real challenges in how that evidence is then fed into decision making and into policy implementation. So we can see that having the evidence is not always the same as knowing what to do. And perhaps this is an area that we can think of as an example of what Roger Pielka Jr. called abortion politics, where there is not consensus about how to respond to something that is really, really challenging. Kate talked about the implementation of actions to address the SDGs being political, and I think that's really significant. I think the other thing I wanted to just reiterate is again Jeremy's point about the sort of vanishing, perhaps, opportunity that the pandemic presented us with. Actually, there was that moment where it felt like the impossible might be possible after all. But I think there is a risk now that we're slipping back to business as usual, and we are not able to apply the same crisis momentum to the climate crisis and the sustainability crisis as we were to the pandemic. And it's not clear that we've learned enough from that. And there is an irony to that, given we are in a climate crisis, and Dario showed us some of the catastrophic impacts we can expect in cities. There's also, I think, a danger that the policy response becomes a little bit narrow. Certainly in the UK, I think we can see the growing phenomenon of what you might call the net zero capture. So actually what is a very broad climate, sustainability, environmental crisis becomes reduced to the, still significant challenge of the transition to net zero. We've heard a lot about the potential of co-benefits. Francesco and Dario talked about co-benefits for health, around reducing pollution and increasing spaces and so on. And Tara also reminded us about some of the cross-cutting impacts, so the negative impacts of the climate crisis in terms of mental health. I think there's also really interesting questions that Dario and Jeremy reminded us about in terms of social justice and what counts as a fair policy response. So we know there are lots of synergies between the SDGs. Francesco noted those right at the beginning, but we know there are trade-offs. We know that there is a challenge as to how to set city policy agendas that can speak to national strategies whilst delivering for citizens' everyday lives. We know that there's a lot of variation in national policy responses. I thought, Dario, your assessment of the alignment between adaptation and health strategies across Europe was really interesting. I thought the discussion around community infrastructure was particularly important. Tara was emphasising that in terms of mental health, but I think we can also see it in terms of clean energy movements that communities are pushing forward. So that's the sub-city level, which is potentially a really powerful area of action. But as Kate reminded us, interactions between the SDGs can be positive, they can be negative. So I think the final thing I wanted to reflect on is the importance of trying to adopt holistic policy responses, of not dealing with this in policy silos. I'm really emphasising the interface that Dario talked about in his presentation. And that takes us, I think, right back to what Kate was talking about in terms of governance through goals, which is a phrase I love and I'm going to immediately steal. Because not only are all the things you set out, Kate, important for that, so is consensus. I think Jeremy's points around the importance of locality and place and of democratic accountability are really key if we're going to achieve that successful governance. So we don't have much time for questions. We're really keen to hear from you. So over to you for your thoughts, your comments, your reflections, please. And if you could just put your hand up to indicate if you'd like to come in.
Or you could ask your question in the chat.
Please do, and I will monitor the chat. Whilst you're all...
Perhaps I kick off with a question from my end, and that will generate other questions. So my question would be towards all five speakers. So if the SDG framework is coming to an end into 2030, what do you think will be next in the limited amount of time over the next 8 years or so for climate, health, sustainability policy in order to perhaps meet some of the Agenda 2030 goals? And I think any of you.
Who would like to take that? If somebody doesn't volunteer, I'll just pick on you. Right, Kate, I'm going to come to you because you're the political scientist.
Yeah, well, this is the big question, right? I think when I'm in a lot of these spaces with folks talking about SDGs, particularly around the post-2030 agenda, what comes next, I've seen there's sort of an emerging discourse of, well, we got really set back by Ukraine. We got really set back by COVID. You know, if we just hadn't had these, we'd be more on track. And I don't actually know if I totally agree. And so there's a little bit of sort of fatalism coming in, which I think is also feeding into what comes after 2030 and saying, well, let's just extend what we have. Let's just put another 5 years on or X number of years on and keep going. And I think that's a missed opportunity. And I also think that this sort of, you know, oh, we would have been better if we didn't have these shocks come through. Because of course they've had very ambivalent effects in different places, from energy transitions to transport and working from home and things like that. So I think there's a hopeful side of this, right? Where, you know, there's increasing, you know, understanding of how important climate is, all of it. There's momentum in certain directions, but I don't think I can answer the question more so than, you know, very hopeful that we see some of these changes that are necessary, but that there is this sort of, you know, sort of fatalistic discourse that I hear from a lot of political actors in this space.
Thank you, Kate. And Dario, I'm interested in your views sitting in the European Environment Agency, and particularly thinking about the point you made about being the science policy interface.
So I think, you know, it's a bit, I mean, of course, I am trying to give a scientific perspective on the situation here without delving too much into the politics of it. But certainly what is interesting is that we had now 4 years ago the European Green Deal, and then the associated policy strategies that were published, the biodiversity strategy, farm to fork, and of course the climate, all the climate developments, and these were all very, very ambitious agendas, and you know, they could be compared to these are ambitious agendas, and they can, I think, in the moment and the enthusiasm there could be equated with the enthusiasm that we had, back in 2015 with the adoption of the SDGs, and now we are kind of in the same place as with the SDGs. So the moment of implementation with the added caveat that, of course, at the EU level, then this means kind of presenting regulations and directives to actually translate these objectives and policy strategies into EU level law, and then for countries then to be able to implement them. And it is actually there where you see a lot of backlash. Of course, I think with climate, there have been a lot of advancements, but you can see that other parts of the agenda, I'm thinking of parts of the farm to fork strategy, not entirely related to what we're discussing today, but still the nature restoration law are facing significant backlash. And of course, not achieving these other parts of the agenda, it links back to what you were saying before, right? Not achieving these other parts of the agenda will absolutely not help, because it will not help on the climate side. We need nature restoration, for example, in order to be able to not only mitigate, but also adapt to climate change, also to protect human health. And you can really see, I guess, the food security argument, the energy crisis argument really coming back to bite. And if I can just, say something that's I don't know if it's hopeful or pessimistic really, but it's just the fact that we are at a very important time in Europe with the European elections next year. And so it is a very pivotal moment, because if some of these regulations proposed by the Commission are not adopted by the end of this mandate, and then something changed in the next Commission and these are not presented again in the same way, then it would be a very problematic situation that we find, because then the whole architecture of the Green Deal would be at risk, essentially.
This is all getting a bit gloomy. Francesca, I wonder if you have thoughts, because you started right at the beginning talking about some of the many, over 100 intersections between the SDGs as they stand. Is that actually too complex? Should we be looking for a simplified framework to replace the SDG, or does it actually need to get even more complex?
That is a very good question. And I guess the SDG are complex and the world is even more complex, I would say. So yeah, I think making everything simple is not the way to go. But I think across the speakers here, I think we have an understanding that we were saying that the SDGs are a political compromise, and they can be taken pragmatically to let's say have some indication of what's an internationally agreed definition of sustainability. And in parallel to the SDG, and of course also the climate agreements, it's not that the world ends in 2030 and we have not achieved them. So it's the same for climate. It's not that after 1.5 degrees the world ends, but of course every single small piece of advancement gets us into a better place. So yeah, I mean, from our point of view, from the research, I guess we can do what we can to try to make available knowledge on these interlinkages, and hopefully give enough information to make whatever comes next from the SDG even more even more useful. And of course, something that we're thinking a lot is we are developing all these methodologies that maybe relate to the SDGs, is also to make them flexible enough so that whatever comes next, we can still, we don't start from scratch, but we can build up from whatever was done up to 2030.
If I could, oh, Sarah, I think you're muted.
I am muted. Thank you. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we might have time for one more quick question after this, but I'd like to come to Jeremy and Tara as well. Tara, I was going to ask you specifically around whether you think the current SDG treatment of mental health is adequate, or whether there's scope to be more ambitious. And Jeremy, to give you a heads up, I thought you might like to tell us a bit more about how to build the societal state in what replaces the SDGs.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, it's a good question. I think the mental health in general related to SDGs is not, there's challenges in mental health and in lots of health in that we don't actually have great measures, and we don't have measures that we can take at population levels. And that's something that the field is working on and is sort of a critical thing that there's a lot of funding going towards. And I think it's something that will be solved. But until it is, it's actually really hard to measure. The measures that typically are made at a countrywide level are suicide rates, which is a little bit late for what we want to think about when we're thinking about mental health. And so I think that a lot of what needs to be done is, and I think this sort of applies broadly to what we're thinking about with the SDGs, is these types of intersectional things where we're looking at the intersection of mental health with all of thinking about things like hunger and climate and all of this. I think that in terms of health research, these intersectional projects are still very new, and there's not a lot of really strong science yet because the funding agencies have only really come around to this very recently. So I think that there is quite a bit of hope that the science will advance and that will allow us to actually make more specific in whatever is the comes after the SDGs, that we're able to actually be more ambitious because we'll have better measures. Because when it comes down to it, the countries and policymakers work to measures. And if those measures aren't very indicative of the health outcomes, then it becomes very difficult to motivate people to move towards them. You really need to be able to measure things to know how well you're doing.
Thank you very much, Tara. Really interesting and really important point about measuring. Jeremy.
Yeah, and just to not sound too doomy, but we have a war in Europe. We have a cost of living crisis. Inflation has been at 10% across most of Europe. We have recovering from a pandemic, the effects of which we felt for a generation, and probably not yet a reckoning with some of the decisions around lockdown in that pandemic. We have the far right on the march across the continent. So replacing SDGs is not going to be top of mind, but I think this conversation needs to cut through the noise, and it can do that if it's an honest conversation and a conversation with a narrative. And I think that narrative, an honest narrative, needs to involve a acknowledgement by those in academia, in politics, and civil society, of course, that neoliberalism has failed, and it needs a new settlement if we are actually going to confront these goals in a way which is meaningful and not, as you said earlier, just more of the same, because more of the same ain't working.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jeremy. And Kate, did you want to add something briefly?
Yeah, I think perhaps I'm just aware of time. We have 2 minutes to the 45 past. So I would probably add 2 quick reflections. One on the back of Sarah's reflection around the fact that this kind of intersections between the different issues and the complexity have only been more recently started to be acknowledged by the funders, and some of them have started to be funded, and we had a lot of discussion already at UCL around this. Another point I would like to add is that this work, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary indeed work, working across sectors, across disciplines, but also, with policymakers and politicians, is not really acknowledged in academia when you have to be highly specialized on a particular discipline. So you sometimes feel falling through the cracks of different disciplines, and for academics or researchers interested in this kind of issues, that's an issue. So I would like to add that to the funding issue. And the point I wanted to make on Jeremy's last comment, again, which has been discussing throughout all my events I've been part of lately, all this, speaking and then to the people and the narrative we present, I think we tend to focus, it's something around communication, and we tend to focus a lot on translating evidence from research, but actually we are not necessarily experts at communicating that evidence. And I think that the work you at UCL Public Policy, it's amazing in terms of, translating some of that work, but that's not the whole story, because we also have to be able as experts to speak to politicians, and that's a completely different set of skills. So we need the diplomacy for climate and health. So we need to be able to engage with politicians who are, elected to start moving or accelerating some of these things. And I think I'll stop there. I don't have time. We are 1 minute past. I don't have time to summarize, and I do not think I'll do a great job. I just want to say that we will be following up with a similar event focusing on London and Stockholm in autumn. So please watch out that space. And very finally, I would like to thank you, our technical support, Vicky Howard, who has been behind the scenes and keeping everything running. And I would like to ask everybody to give quiet round of applauses to our speakers, my co-chair, and thank you everybody for participating. So thank you very much, and I hope I'll see some of you in autumn.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.